Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're listening to this. This is our third lecture of week 1, and we're going to talk about African kingdoms that existed during this period and how they were impacted by the slave trade, and also how they impacted the slave trade. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, in our last lecture we talked about the two corridors of the slave trade in Africa prior to Europeans becoming part of the slave trade. But I want to talk a little bit more about slavery in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, sub-Saharan Africa, what that means is it's exactly what it sounds like. Sub meaning below the Saharan desert, which, as you can see from the map, is quite honestly most of the continent. Now, sub-Saharan Africa, with its extended distances, very few long rivers, was the one continent with the greatest hurdles to a shift in patterns from self-sufficiency to exchange of agriculture and urbanization. Exchanges of food for manufactured goods over distances greater than 20 miles were incredibly expensive. You couldn't transport things down very long rivers. You had to do it either by human transport or by putting items on a donkey. And this meant that what you're moving around, how much food, how much finished goods, is very limited because you can only move what a human or a donkey can carry. You can't move much more than that. So this means that items like salt, copper, and iron are all in very high demand and very expensive because you can only move very little of it. So that means a lot of things that people in sub-Saharan Africa needed, they made themselves. It's things like pottery, textiles, baskets, utensils, leather goods, and weapons, because it was simply just too expensive to buy them from a merchant because, again, it's really hard to move a great deal of items around. So self-sufficiency was required in large households. In villages with limited outside trade, a lot of times in many cultures you had polygamous households so that you had a large number of children, right, who are being produced to help run the farm, run the ranch, whatever your home is trying to produce. That need for a lot of children, need for a lot of labor is because of this need for self-sufficiency. Now, to increase your wealth, a household owner oftentimes would raid neighboring villages and acquire captives that they would then enslave and put to work inside and outside the home. So again, this is a way that slavery was used in Africa. So once again, as I said in our last lecture, this has nothing to do with race. But it does have to do with wealth. That does connect it. But it has nothing to do with race. It's all about I captured you, I conquered you, therefore you're now my slave. Now, the more stratified such societies were, with chiefly or royal institutions, armies, fiscal officers, etc., the more slaves rose in positions of responsibility and oftentimes independence. So within the African slavery system, it's a flexible institution. So slaves, I'm not saying that this was a good life. I'm not trying to make it sound like all rosy and rainbows or something, but there was flexibility within this slave system for slaves to rise to positions of power and even attain their independence, their freedom, which is something, as we saw in the last lecture, that was not open to slaves in the Atlantic slave trade system. So quite different. And this is really important and very integral to understand because this is how the Africans who are trading other Africans see slavery. They see it like this. This is how their cultural understanding of slavery is. So when they're trading other Africans to the Europeans, this is their concept of slavery. Not so much what's happening in the Atlantic slave trade, which, as you know from the last lecture, is quite different. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple African kingdoms who were impacted by the slave trade and impactful on the slave trade because, as I mentioned in the last lecture, there were many powerful African kingdoms during this period that were so powerful that they prevented the Europeans from just swanning in and taking people. Europeans were purchasing slaves from these various different kingdoms along the west coast of Africa. And one of those was in Benin. Now, Portugal was the first European country to engage in the slave trade. Remember, I mentioned in the last lecture that they had taken some islands off the west coast of Africa and had turned them into sugar plantations, and they began importing slaves to work on those sugar plantations. So when Portugal began trading slaves for those sugar plantations on the west coast of Africa, African chiefs and kings had to evaluate the comparative value of slaves for their households versus for sale. Where could they make the most money? The Kingdom of Benin in the rainforest region west of the Niger Delta was an early example of this very careful calculation. The ruler at this time, King Ua, was the first to rise to dominance over chiefs and assume the title of king in Benin. Through conquest in all directions, he acquired large numbers of slaves. His kingdom emerged on the basis of slaves employed in the army, as well as for the construction of extensive earthwork projects, as well as protecting the capital of Benin City. Early trade contacts between Portuguese mariners and Benin intensified when the successor of Ua granted permission to the Portuguese to build a fort on the coast in 1487. But the king kept the power in the sense that he kept the exchange of items like palm oil, ivory, woolens, beads, and slaves for things like guns, gunpowder, metalware, salt, and cottons. He kept this whole trade under close control. This is very smart, right? If this trade is going on in your country, you want to make sure you get the upper hand. A generation later, when the kings prohibited the sale of male slaves, the Portuguese promptly abandoned their fort. The reason why the king ordered the end of the sale of male slaves is they felt like they were actually running out of slaves within Benin. And so it's not like they were ending slavery, they just wanted to keep male slaves in Benin to do agricultural and soldiering, things like that. But the Portuguese, that's who they primarily wanted to work on the sugar plantation, so that's why they abandoned their fort. This was tough for many of the traders in Benin who were making a lot of money with the Portuguese. So later a compromise was reached whereby a limited number of male slaves were traded, perhaps some 30% of the total trade volume between Portugal and Benin, in return for firearms. So that's a common pattern you see in Africa, is that African kingdoms will trade slaves in return for firearms from the Portuguese, because firearms are obviously something that are very useful in a military, and they're thinking are going to help them stay in power. Now, the Kingdom of Benin did allow missionaries from Portugal into the country, and many members of the royal dynasty acculturated to the Portuguese, making Benin an economically diversified and culturally very complex African Atlantic state. But they are able to become this power and wealthy nation mostly because of the slave trade, because that's what the Portuguese were interested in purchasing. Now, slave exports remain restricted during the following 200 years when Benin was a strong centralized state. Under several weak kings, decentralization set in. Provincial chiefs began to compete with each other, and the more they competed with each other, the more they wanted guns so that they could get the upper hand. To buy more guns, toward the end of the 1600s, a weak Benin palace lifted the restrictions on the slave trade. Even more weapons were purchased and slaves were sold during a civil war in the first half of the 18th century. But the kingdom reunified, and the palace never lost complete control over Benin's trade with the Portuguese. And from the mid-17th century onward, the Dutch and the British began to horn in on the trade. From the mid-18th century onward, the kings of Benin even encouraged indigenous gunsmiths to make muskets to help alleviate their dependence on Europeans for guns. But what this means is that the more they needed firearms, the more they fought amongst themselves, the more people they traded to the Europeans for the slave trade. So it's a vicious circle. Now the next kingdom we're going to talk about is the kingdom of Dahomey. Now in the 1700s, Dahomey was an expanding kingdom, as you can see here on the west coast of Africa. They pursued the same sort of thing that was happening in Benin, where they were selling prisoners of war to Europeans in exchange for European weapons. The exact same exchange is going. And in Dahomey, the money that they're making off of the slave trade, along with the weapons, allows them to fund a 12,000 soldier army, which will allow them to grow even more than they already had. Europeans were buying roughly 6,000 slaves per year from this part of Africa. Dahomey, as they expanded, they conquered other areas, took those conquered people, and then sold them to Europeans for more money and firearms to again create this cycle. This cycle meant that they were one of the most powerful kingdoms in Africa during the period and had a near monopoly on slave trade in the area. Now, the money from this slave trade allowed them to build huge, elaborate palaces, which are now quite famous. The Dahomey palaces are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Here's some of the pictures of them. So if you were to go to the former kingdom of Dahomey, you would be able to see these. These animal carvings and reliefs, I think, are just absolutely beautiful. But all of this is funded by their interaction with Europeans, the European desire for slaves, and the Dahomeyan desire for money and firearms to maintain their empire. So now I want to turn to a very interesting and often overlooked aspect of the kingdom of Dahomey, which are the Amazon women warriors. Now these female warriors were part of the military expansion of Dahomey and part of what allowed the kingdom to expand the way that it did and to take more of those slaves. These women were the first palace guards, and then they became a combat fighting force. They were probably the earliest professional female combat force that we know of for sure in history. Now, there may have been earlier ones, but we're still waiting sort of for the jury to come back in terms of archaeological research. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, an all-female fighting force in history is incredibly rare. So even if they're not the first ones, they certainly are a rarity in human history at this point. And when Europeans first encountered them, they nicknamed them the Amazons from Greek mythology. Now, if you've seen the recent Wonder Woman movie, you've seen the Amazons talked about a lot. Not exactly the same, but very, very from the same place, basically. So that's why they're called the Amazons of Dahomey. That is probably not what they called themselves. But because the people of Dahomey did not have a written language, we don't know what these women were called in their own language. So unfortunately, we're stuck calling them by what the Europeans nicknamed them. But they did have a fierce reputation. Even Europeans revered them with a high amount of respect. The Dahomey people, as I said, had no written language, so much of what we know about these women comes from the accounts of Europeans who went there and wrote about them. So it's definitely from a skewed viewpoint. Now, other than the king, men were not allowed to be in the palace at night, so the royal guard was made up of women, and in the early stages were most likely some of his wives. These women were features in processionals on feast day parades. Their initial baptism into combat came from being put into the back rows at battles to make the army look bigger than it was, but for a long time they weren't expected to fight. But the need to constantly expand the kingdom meant that they kind of needed all soldiers to fight all the time. And so the Amazon force expanded to roughly 6,000 female warriors. Now, the women traditionally fought bare-chested, and this was seen kind of like the Viking berserkers. Like, I mean, how tough are you, right, to fight without armor? And this was also seen as very terrifying to who they were fighting because they were women. And gender expectations, even in Africa during the time, were not quite adjusted to a female fighting force, let alone women who were fighting bare-chested. So this was seen as an intimidation tactic against your enemy, that you wouldn't be expecting a woman to be running at you to fight, especially when she was, bare-chested. So this was seen as very, very terrifying. Now, the Amazons of Dahomey were so revered that they would have had several slaves of their own each. Oftentimes when they walked down the street, they would have usually a child run ahead of them and sort of announce, the Amazons are coming, so that everyone could come out and sort of see them, again, revere them. They had this very high status in Dahomeyan culture. Now the picture here is from the 19th century, obviously once photography was invented. And unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of imagery of these women just because of, again, when photography was invented, but luckily we do have some. These are probably some of the last Amazons of Dahomey. Throughout the 19th century, they become less and less used for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about in later weeks. So I always love talking about the Amazons, as you can probably tell. They're some of my favorite people in history to talk about. You just got to admire people who are so kick-ass. Now, the Amazons take their vows of marriage, as it were, to the king. If you're an Amazon, you don't actually get married, and you don't have children. You are expected not to be sexually active. Your vow of marriage is to the king. That's not necessarily consummated. It's not an actual marriage necessarily, but it's to show that that's where your ultimate loyalty is. Your loyalty is not to a husband or to children. It's to the king and the king alone. In terms of social hierarchy, they were higher on that ladder than non-royal women. So they were definitely below the wives of the king, but higher than any other women. And as I said, they would have had multiple slaves each. And even though they fought as a unit, they would have fought side by side with male soldiers of the Dahomey army. So again, this is very rare for history to have an all-female fighting unit, but then also to have them fighting alongside men. This is incredibly interesting and unusual for the time period. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Kingdom of the Congo. So farther south on the central West African coast, the Portuguese established trade relations with several kingdoms, among which the Congo was the most important. Now, this kingdom was located south of the Congo River, where, with rainforest to the north, a savanna to the south. The Congo was the oldest and most centralized kingdom in the region. It had emerged around 1400 or so, about 100 years before the Portuguese showed up. Now, the capital, Mbanza, had about 60,000 people living directly in the city and about 300,000 people living around it. So it was quite large. Now, to defend their growing empire, the kings of the Congo relied on a standing army of about 5,000 troops, which included about 500 musketeers in the 1500s. They appointed members of the royal family as governors throughout the empire to make sure everything was running smoothly. The governors collected rents from these other areas that was sent back to the king. Royal representatives traveled around to represent the king himself. Farther away, vassal kings that they called dukes governed and sent tributes back to the capital. So they have a very elaborate system to keep this empire in place. Now, the kings of the Congo converted to Christianity early on and sent members of the ruling family to Portugal for their education. So from a very early period, there's a real deep relationship between the Congo and Portugal. Portuguese missionaries converted members of the court, many of the provincial chiefs. In the ruling class, many read and wrote in Portuguese and Latin fluently, impressing European aristocrats with their knowledge of European culture. Congolese royalty oftentimes wore Portuguese dress, listened to church music and hymns, and drank wine that was imported from the Canary Islands. Now, the result of all this interaction was the creation of an African Creole culture in which you have a blending of Congolese culture and Portuguese European culture, which is quite fascinating in this particular period. Now, the Congo began selling slaves to Portuguese traders as early as 1502 for labor on those sugar plantations off the west coast of Africa. By the mid-1500s, the kings permitted the export of a few thousand slaves every year. But Portugal wanted more, and in 1571, the King of Portugal charged a member of the Portuguese aristocracy with creating a colony in the adjacent kingdom of Ndongo for the mining of salt and silver by slaves. So the Portuguese want more, so they basically go in and try to create their own colony. And as you might expect, this is going to lead to some problems. At first, it was argued that, the Portuguese tried to argue they were trying to do something good here, but it became clear that this was a colony, and the king of the Congo turned against him, and you have a full-scale war between them over basically over control of the slave trade as well as territory. In this war, which lasted from 1579 until 1657, with some breaks in between, the Portuguese allied themselves with Ibangala bands. The Ibangala were other groups of people that had a bone to pick with the Congo government. They were known as very fierce warriors, and so a very logical ally for the Portuguese. Now, both sides spread a lot of propaganda, tales of cannibalism, tales that they were forcibly recruiting child soldiers, scared both sides. Now, the Ibangalas consumed large quantities of palm wine and imported Portuguese wine, and so they had, I guess that's to say that they had more of a reason for allying with the Portuguese. Together with a few hundred Portuguese musketeers, and tens of thousands of Ibangalas raided the kingdoms of both Ndongo and the Congo for slaves, oftentimes stealing 15,000 people every year. So this is really ticking off both the people who live in Ndongo as well as the people in the Congo, that the Portuguese are doing this. And the Portuguese are doing this because they are trying to sort of cut out the middleman and make the most money that they can. Now, the Portuguese desire to have a deeper influence on the slave trade led to regions outside the Congo getting involved. The Portuguese set up a fort in 1617, and in 1622, they invited the king of Umbanda to a peace conference to try to sort this out. And the king of Umbanda sent his sister Nzinga to negotiate with the Portuguese. And at the meeting with the Portuguese governor, she noticed that he was the only one seated. And in an effort to demonstrate her power, she had one of her servants get on her hands and knees to provide a seat for Nzinga, which is what's depicted there. So you can already see Nzinga is definitely not to be trifled with. She converted to Christianity to placate the Portuguese governor and went back to her brother, having secured peace negotiations. In 1626, she became queen after her brother committed suicide. She proved to be a powerful opponent to the Portuguese. She formed alliances with former rivals to give her a bigger army and begin a 30-year war against the two groups. One of the alliances she made was with the Dutch, which was really smart because it irritated the Portuguese a great deal. But again, it's this enemy of my enemy is my friend. They're really tired of the Portuguese, so they want to kick them out. And together, Queen Nzinga's army, along with the Dutch, fought against the Portuguese, having many successes. Now, the Dutch were eventually defeated by the Portuguese in 1648, and after that they left this part of Africa. They'll spend more time in South Africa after this. But Nzinga carried on the fight well into her 60s. She was riding into battle, leading her troops, She ended up living into her 80s and actually died peacefully in her sleep, which in history doesn't happen to a lot of leaders. But it was the desire to control the slave market in Africa in order to make more money that led all these groups to be fighting amongst each other. So this desire for profit on these plantations in the Americas ultimately leads to political and social ramifications in Africa as well. But it also demonstrates, all of these demonstrate the power of the African kingdoms at this point. And that power will have been eroded by the 19th century, and you'll start to see Europeans chipping away at Africa slowly by that point. Now, there are many impacts of the slave trade on West African culture. Of course, with so many people being captured and taken as slaves, the effects of the slave trade were bound to be serious, at least for the people who were taken and for their families and communities. People were separated from everything they knew and never saw their homes or their families again. People left behind had no way to know what became of their spouses, their children, their relatives, and friends. In areas where raiding for slaves was common, people put up barriers around their towns and dwellings. They refused to leave their children home alone. They organized neighborhood watches to try to protect themselves, and if caught, they often tried to run away. But these efforts were difficult when outnumbered by raiding parties, especially if those parties had guns, which they would have purchased from the Europeans. In West Africa, the predominant way the Europeans got slaves was through cooperation and collaboration with the African kingdoms we talked about. So why did they do that? Well, some people say it's because slavery already existed in Africa, and so it wasn't culturally unusual to African slave traders. But as you now know, African slavery was very different from the new Atlantic slave trade, mostly because the European trade saw slaves as a commodity, as property, whereas in African society, slaves were usually associated with families and had rights, even if they were lowest on the social scale. Some Africans did try to stop the slave trade, or at least protested it, but once the gun-slave cycle begun, it was tremendously hard to stop. Aside from the traumatic effects of slavery on those directly affected, there is a vigorous scholarly debate about its actual impacts on sub-Saharan African populations. It's important to keep in mind that the effects of the slave trade were highly complex, and as a result, they weren't uniform over time or region. For one thing, areas with a consistent supply of slaves shifted over time. The availability of slaves increased dramatically, for example, in areas experiencing warfare between rival states. In such areas, victorious states frequently sold both combatants and civilians of the opposing side into slavery. However, once those wars were over, the availability of slaves would have diminished. Furthermore, the extent to which inland African societies felt the impacts of the trade also varied by time and place. As the trade increased in volume in the 18th century, slave traders reached further and further inland to procure the slaves they needed. In one area at the end of the 18th century, slaves were being brought to the Atlantic coast of Africa from as far as 1,000 miles away inland. Now, one thing I want to make very clear is that sub-Saharan Africa is a great, big, giant place. And it's certainly true that the Atlantic slave trade did not touch all or even most of the lower half of Africa. The largest effects seem to have been in the West and West Central Africa. That's where most of the slaves came from. For all of these reasons, it's difficult to generalize about the impacts of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa as a continent or even West Africa. The latest scholarship indicates that in some areas of West Africa, it seems that the numbers of people sold into the slave trade slowed population growth significantly, while in other areas population seems to have just been mildly reduced. Although it does seem that the preference for male slaves led to an imbalance of men and women in many African societies. In terms of politics and society, the Atlantic slave trade produced different results for different people. Along the Gold Coast, for example, the slave trade encouraged state building and consolidation as the elite wealthy groups sought to increase their wealth by forming powerful alliances to control the trade with Europeans. In other areas, however, stiff competition for slave trade with Europeans encouraged political fragmentation and war. The African experience of the slave trade would also have depended, of course, on whether you became a slave, were trying to keep from being a slave, or were someone who captured slaves to trade. We must keep in mind that the procurement of slaves was dominated almost completely by Africans. So some of the questions you should be asking yourself is why? What would have been the point of this? What were they after? Why didn't Europeans take over? Well, the African kingdoms wouldn't let them. As we've seen, these are not weak kingdoms at all. Europeans had to be very careful not to tick off these other kingdoms, which obviously the Portuguese were really bad at. Africans wanted goods, and they were very savvy about quality. They wouldn't take cheap crap for slaves. They wanted high quality items. They wanted iron, cloth, metal, and specifically guns. Also, they were not decimated by European diseases like people in the Americas. So the Europeans couldn't just roll in and do whatever they wanted. They had to negotiate because they didn't have the power to overrun these African kingdoms. For those who procured the slaves and functioned as middlemen in the slave trade, or who controlled the slave trade in their region, the African slave trade could be both lucrative as well as a means to greater power. Some groups, fearful that they would be swallowed up by slave traders, allied themselves with powerful states for protection. Others relocated their communities to remote, inaccessible areas to avoid being abducted. Many others armed themselves, built fortified towns, and did their best to survive under these terrible circumstances. And certainly many people became slave traders to protect themselves and their families from becoming slaves. So again, this is an incredibly complicated system. And I like to talk about it in Africa, even if it's a bit brief, because a lot of times when we talk about the slave trade, we only talk about its impact in the Americas, and it's obviously very impactful on Africa as well. So now we're going to turn to talking about the end of the slave trade, how and why this system finally comes to a halt. Now, the end of the slave trade will begin in Britain. Now, Britain had become, by the mid-16 to late 1600s, had become the dominating force within the Atlantic slave trade. And in Britain, the abolitionists, which all that refers to as abolitionists, means they're working towards the abolition, the end of slavery and the slave trade. So first they go after the slave trade, and the leader of the abolitionists in England is a guy named William Wilberforce, who's pictured there. And through an extensive amount of work, Wilberforce and his followers succeed in 1807, the British Parliament officially ends the slave trade. And basically what they do in 1807 is they say the slave trade is illegal, and they put pressure on everybody else to stop as well. So in 1808, the United States stops buying slaves from the Atlantic slave trade. 1814, France, the Netherlands, Spain is really, really far out. But this doesn't mean that slavery ends. This just means they stop importing slaves. But slavery still exists, and in fact it still existed in the British Empire. But the British after this will begin to sort of see themselves as sort of the police of this system, so they will patrol the Atlantic Ocean trying to keep countries from importing slaves. And you'll be reading about this in your book Inhuman Traffic, so you will see this again, how the British kind of are conceptualizing their role in this. But this doesn't, as I said, mean that slavery is over. The slave trade is over. That's a step. Now the abolitionists turn to ending the entire practice of slavery. And that will be very, very prominent in Britain as well as the United States. The British are kind of on the front end of this. In 1833, the British Parliament bans slavery within the British Empire, the entire British Empire. And they offer £20 million in total to slave owners to basically pay them for the fact that they're losing all this free labor. So this was supposed to be compensation. So 1833 onward, slavery is illegal in the British Empire. Does that mean it actually ended? No. It takes a very long time, decades. A lot of times what happens, and it's very similar to what happened in the United States after slavery was ended, was that because the slaves had never been taught things like how to read, write, math, etc., a lot of times they were stuck still working on the same plantations, even though they were now ostensibly free. And a lot of times their former masters, now bosses, I guess you could say, paid them abysmally. So it was good that slavery was over, but it was going to be a long road to a better life. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, the United States ends slavery officially over 1865, end of the American Civil War. Brazil is the last country to outlaw slavery in 1888. So not that long ago, actually. Now, there are many leaders of the abolitionist movement, but I am going to talk specifically about Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass was born in 1818. He was the son of a slave woman and an unknown white man. He was born in Maryland. There is some speculation about who Frederick Douglass's father was. It very possibly was his mother's owner and ultimately his owner. He spent his early childhood with his grandparents, seeing his mom about 4 or 5 times a week. He never knew any details about his father, and his mother died when he was only 7 years old. And at the age of 8, he was sent to Baltimore to a ship carpenter, and that's where he learned to read and write and was exposed to the ideas of the abolitionists. After 7 years there, he was hired out to a farm with a manager who was very well known for being incredibly cruel and brutal to slaves. In 1838, Douglass was finally able to escape north to New York City. He settled in Massachusetts and married a woman he met in Maryland, and he changed his name to Frederick Douglass. So that is the name that he chose for himself. He became a speaker for the abolitionist cause and published his autobiography in 1845, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. He went on a speaking tour. He went even to the British Isles to promote his book and also to make connections with abolitionists working there. He actually conferred with President Lincoln during the American Civil War and helped recruit African American soldiers for the Union Army and continued to fight for African American rights after the Civil War. In 1889, he was appointed as the U.S. minister. Basically, that's like an ambassador to Haiti. He is the first African American diplomat in American history. So, incredible titan of the abolitionist movement. Now, while abolition of slavery brought legal freedom for Africans and African American slaves, as I'm sure you all know, it did not bring political equality or social equality. In most places, whether that was the Caribbean, Brazil, or the United States, they were prevented from voting through property restrictions, literacy tests, and campaigns of intimidation. Nor did emancipation bring social or economic improvements. White elites owned most of the property in these areas, and they kept blacks in subordination by forcing them to accept low-paying work. And as I said before, they oftentimes ended up working the same jobs they'd been working before abolition for very little pay. So again, it's a step in the right direction, but it wouldn't be historically accurate to think everything just got immediately better. It takes a very long time. So some conclusions about the last 2 lectures. Slavery is not unusual in human history, unfortunately. But, and that's why it's in big bold letters there, but the Atlantic slave trade was unusual in its scope and in its brutality. This is the largest slave trade in human history of the largest number of people, and it is the most brutal. Because the founding idea here is that these aren't people. These are the same as cows or horses. They're a commodity, they're property. And this is all done for money. That's the root here. It's all done out of the desire for more wealth. It's also important to remember that this has significant yet uneven impacts on West African society. That there are impacts on both sides of the Atlantic here. Huge, huge ones. And if you remember nothing else about this moving forward, remember this last part. That it is because of the Atlantic slave trade that Europeans create the concept of racism to justify what they're doing. And this is so important. All of this should be considered when you write your paper about inhuman traffic. But it's very important because if we can understand this, the root of racism, why it's created, and we can understand this, that it's created out of a desire for money, out of to make as much money as you can. If we can understand that human beings did this, I mean, not you and I, but human beings did this, then we can find a way to move past it, I think. So hopefully that's an optimistic end to a rough bit of lecture. But that concludes week 1, and I look forward to week 2.